My name is Ann Rimler. I'm the president of the Boynton Beach Historical Society. Welcome, everyone. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, we are an organization which is 55 years young, and we service, let's see, I'm going to ask that you mute.
145 and 710 on High Fiber Fridays.
I'm going to ask that you mute your volume. Okay, so we are a 55-year young organization, and we service the cities and towns in the Boynton Beach, Lantana, Briny Breezes, Manalapan area. But with the advent of Zoom, we now reach a lot further. And last time we did a Zoom program, we had people dialing in from 5 different states. So take a minute and let us know where you're dialing in from tonight. Put your locations into chat. I will also let you know 2 things. One is that we've got a membership special still going, buy one, give one. When you pay for your membership, you can give a membership to a friend or family member for free for 1 year. And the other thing I would like to mention is that this program is sponsored in part by Florida Humanities. And at the end of this program, we're going to ask that you complete a survey. I will send the link around in email so that you can access it easily for how to get to the survey. In order to complete the survey, you will need to know the title of tonight's program, Florida's Underground Railroad, and it was presented by Magdalena Lamar. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce Barbara Reedy, the first vice president and program chair.
Thank you very much, Ann. Tonight's speaker is one of an elite group of speakers selected by the Florida Humanities Program. Dr. Magdalena Lamar was a history and sociology professor at Miami-Dade College. Today, her focus now is on Florida history and pop culture, addressing diversity and social justice. At this point, please join me in welcoming Dr. Magdalena Lamar.
I'm not a doctor, but thank you for the title. I'm full professor of sociology and history. Thank you so much for inviting me to your program and for this opportunity to share this information. And we have to also, I guess, thank the Florida Humanities Council because they make this program possible by funding you and supporting me. Today's program, as was mentioned, is the Florida Underground Railroad. Are the notes still not visible? I just want to verify. Everything good? I didn't hear from anybody. I guess they're fine.
You have to share your screen.
Oh, I'm not sharing it. Oh, I thought I had done that. Okay, wait a minute. Let me see. I'm so sorry. Didn't I?
Well, you did, but then I ran.
Oh, I see. Okay, so I'm here. All right. I'm so sorry. Let me share, and of course I have to find the screen to share. See, here I am. Okay, sorry. I thought I was there. Okay. Share. All right, there we are. Okay.
Good.
Let's
Yes.
start again. Okay, and the notes, let me make sure. Are the notes showing or no?
No notes. You're
Good.
ready.
Okay, good. I'm going to move this down. Anyway, today's program, all right, is about Black history. It's part of the Florida History's programs on this topic, but it's also about Florida history. That's one of the things I like to address, and it's American history. This is a period of Florida history which basically covers the Spanish period from Ponce de Leon until we get to the annexation of Florida, purchase of Florida and annexation by the United States. This program is about pioneers because we have to look at them as that. They were explorers, they were pioneers. They came here, some of them voluntarily, some of them not, enslaved persons, but they all played a role in the early history of the colonization and settlement of Florida. And this is a role and a contribution that is important to see. When we look at them, we're going to be examining people and their descendants, all right, who came here in different ways, but primarily as part of the Underground Railroad, they came searching for freedom. They basically achieved their own freedom from enslavement. Now, these are the Florida underground routes. You might be familiar with all of the ones in the north. We're going to concentrate just on this region. And yes, we're going to look at areas like Mexico. We're going to look at Cuba. We're going to look at this region right here of Florida, northern Florida. The Everglades play a part, and the Bahamas. So this is what we call the Southern Underground Railroad. Some individuals did flee from as far up as Virginia, going down into these routes, because Florida was an important area from the beginning that was used as a refugee sanctuary for the escaped enslaved persons. One of the things that I do have is a lot of quotes. And if you're interested in any of these books, I can provide them. But what we're looking at basically, again, is a people who basically did not passively accept being slaves. They fought for their freedom. I mentioned that they were explorers and they were settlers, and I want to start with Juan Garrido. As you can see, he was a conquistador. He was an explorer. He actually was part of Ponce de Leon's group. He originally came into Hispaniola, was part in 1502. He was part of the conquest of Hispaniola. From there, he went to Puerto Rico, where he worked with Ponce de Leon. He went into Cuba, he came into Florida, and later he went into Mexico. But he is very important for another reason. He is, according to our current history, our records, the first documented person. Okay, there may have been others, but we're talking about historical records. He's the first documented free person of African ancestry to set foot in what will become the future United States. And I like to emphasize this because, again, we need to remember that not everybody who came here who had African ancestry was an enslaved person. There were also many of them who were free. We're going to also be talking about Florida, and we're going to be addressing some areas, and you're going to say, wow, why are we talking about South Carolina and Georgia? Well, the reality was that those territories were part of Florida. Excuse me. This map here shows you the Treaty of Tordesillas. You see these lines here? After Spain traveled west with Columbus and discovered the Americas, and Portugal went around the Cape of Good Hope and reached India and China, they basically asked the Pope to divide the world between them. Bit arrogant, yes, but this was the times, and they were the first two nations to really explore this new territories. So what they did was they created this line, and they asked the Pope that everything west would be Spanish and everything east would be Portuguese. Now, they still didn't know the size of the continents they were dealing with and what lands were there. They knew the size of the earth because this had been done by some Greek philosophers, Aristophanes, I believe. So they knew the size of the earth, but they did not know all of the land masses. So this line was drawn in this area, and then it was drawn on this side. Because of where the line fell, Spain actually by accident got the Philippines. That's how they end up with the Philippines in this region here. But you see this region here? All of this territory, although it had not been explored, was claimed by the Spanish, which means that they claimed it all the way up the coast of Florida. So when we talk about La Florida, it includes all of this territory from all the way here, right, the coastline of Florida, all the way across into the areas that they will then explore, the whole southwestern United States, Georgia, right, actually South Carolina, which are the two areas where most of the enslaved Africans will come from. But really, they basically claimed everything till Newfoundland, which they weren't able to hold on to. So this is what we mean when we talk about La Florida. It's an extensive territory, and this region here will be the primary source where we're going to have a lot of enslaved Africans escape and come to Florida. Now, the individuals we're going to meet in this presentation were called maroons. And maroonage, or running away, that's basically what it means. They were individuals who used resistance to slavery by running away. That's what basically it means. They chose to free themselves. So when we look at the maroons, they are ancestors, all right, of enslaved Africans, and they came, many of them, from Africa, but we're going to see that some of them actually came originally from areas in Spain and Portugal. The Spanish called them cimarrones, which means like feral animal, because they ran into the wild and were considered wild, all justifications for enslaving them. We use the term maroon from the British. They shortened it to maroons, all right? But basically, what we're talking about is, in general, the term maroons is anyone who was enslaved who escaped for freedom. That's what the term means today. Now, who were the first maroons? They fled amongst the Indians, all right, and taught them bad customs. This was Nicolás de Obando, the governor of Hispaniola, in the early colonization and conquest of Hispaniola. He came there with what they would call Ladino, or Hispanic, Iberian or Hispanic slaves, and he claimed to conquer and colonize the area. And even though they spoke Spanish and they were Christian, and many of them were actually free, a lot of them weren't, what they did was, according to him, they ran away. And this is one of the reasons why he says, please don't send any more, because they're teaching the native population bad customs. Why the first group of people that were enslaved in the Americas were the native population. And they also resisted, fleeing into the mountains of all of these islands, which are an archipelago of submerged mountain ranges. So the first maroons in the Americas were probably in the island of Hispaniola, which is today Santo Domingo, the Dominican Republic, and Haiti, but also all of the islands of the Caribbean. They would be in the mountains of Puerto Rico, and the mountains of Jamaica, the mountains of Cuba, and because this was a place of refuge. Now, of course, he eventually doesn't follow through with that. He requests them to be brought in because they needed laborers. The Spanish that came were not interested in labor. They were interested in getting land and becoming hidalgos and gaining wealth, maybe going home and getting titles. So they needed labor. And once the native population resisted or died or basically fled, then the enslaved population became the Africans. First, the ones that were brought from Spain, and later the ones brought directly from Africa. Now, from the moment that they set foot in Florida, in the Americas, and in Florida in particular, maroons have played an integral part in the development of this part of the world, but especially in Florida. We have to think of them as being there with the early communities that were colonizing. Now, we're going to meet the first maroons and the first Floridians in a way, because again, remember that this region I mentioned here, South Carolina, was La Florida. The first maroons will come to the mainland in 1526 with de Ayllon's attempt to colonize Florida. Even though Ponce de Leon comes in 1513, he is not successful. The tribes in Florida had already encountered the Spanish in this area. He brings with him two free Black men. One is Juan Garrido, and another one is Juan Gonzalez, who was an interpreter of the Taínos, because this is where the Taínos were fleeing. And of course, when he comes here, they resist. So this is where you get this reputation that the natives of Florida were wild, that were savage, that they were dangerous. And what's going to happen is a series of attempts at colonization that will not succeed. Now, he had approximately 700 colonists. The data is not consistent, but only about 150 survive. He basically gets sick and dies in 3 months, and the colony is basically in chaos now. When they decide to leave, interestingly, 100 of the enslaved Africans did not return with them. Where did they go? Nobody knows. It is believed that they joined the Guale Indians, who the Spanish had tried to enslave. And this was part of what happened to the colony. There was a rebellion on the part of the Indians. They set fire to the settlement. The enslaved Africans evidently joined them and fled. This may be the origin of the first leg, or the first phase, right, of the Underground Railroad in Florida, because this will be the first documented group that leaves. Now, in the case of future documented groups, these are other attempts, all of these. and they all failed. Every single one of them. So here we have Lucas Vázquez de Ayllón, Panfilo de Alvarez. Only 4 individuals survived of his 600 plus attempt to colonize Florida. Hernando de Soto, I think 80 survived, all right? Tristan de Luna y Arellano, I think also about 80 to 100 survived. Were not able to settle, but they all said one thing as a result of every single attempt. Every expedition reported that both free and enslaved Africans would disappear into the wilderness, every single one of them. And in some cases, they would complain that Spanish soldiers also fled. This was an area that was new, that was open, that was wild. So this became an area that people sought refuge in. We're going to look at St. Augustine now, because this was the first successful colonization that happens in Florida, in the sense that the other ones were attempts. The Pensacola colony lasted about 2 years. That was Tristan de Luna. But St. Augustine will be the successful colony. Never very profitable. It's going to serve a very specific function, but it is the first permanent settlement in the Americas for the Spanish, and also for any group in the United States. Now, when we look at St. Augustine, the area of St. Augustine is going to be very important for a particular reason, and we're going to see it, why it is in a few seconds. But the first colony of Florida, in this particular case, St. Augustine, was actually included the first Black Floridians, the settlers that we have documented. And as you can see, they had both free, right, and enslaved. The population, the Black population, was 12% because there were never enough Spanish persons that were interested in coming. Once Cortés went to Mexico and Pizarro went to Peru, there was no interest in coming to Florida or even the Caribbean, because that's not where the wealth was. One of every person was free. Now, even in this situation where they were free in St. Augustine, the founder of Florida, Pedro Menéndez Aviles, he said that they kept escaping, that they kept running into the wilderness. So even though you have individuals that were part of the colonization, they also attempted to leave. We're looking at the reason why in a second. Castillo de San Marcos is the basic structure that was built in St. Augustine. Why? If this area was not attractive because it didn't have gold and it didn't attract Spaniards, why was this area so important? Why invest so much time in this? It was very important for Florida to hold on to its territories, because by now the English and the French are encroaching into their territory. They're claiming areas north, including, going down the Mississippi, claiming New Orleans by the French, establishing colonies in Jamestown and in Plymouth. So we see this encroachment. And Florida, as the frontier for the Spanish in this region, and St. Augustine in particular, are very important. This fort was actually built by free and enslaved Africans. They were called the royal slaves because they were skilled artisans. And this was not the only castillo that was built. Many of them were built throughout the Caribbean and Central and South America. Why? Because this was the route that the gold went through in order to reach Spain. You see right here, right on this coastline. So this is the vital role that St. Augustine will play. It is the last leg of all of this gold. And if you look at other areas here, these were other places where forts were built in Puerto Rico, in Cuba, in Santo Domingo, in Cartagena de las Indias. All of this were areas had these forts built, these massive structures, which are still there. And it was to protect the Spanish main, to protect the gold. But you see this leg, this was why it was so important. Now, one of the things I'm going to mention quickly here, it's a different program, so we'll have to look forward to that one. But not only did you have them escaping to land, but you had a lot of, this was a pirate haven. And a lot of the individuals that were enslaved Africans became pirates. All right. This was a very unique and different way. It provided them with sanctuary, and nearly 1/4 of the crew of pirate ships, evidently, were Black. I don't know if you recall when Pirates of the Caribbean came out, they actually had Black pirates on it. And I remember people kind of saying, oh, do they have to make everything politically correct? Why do they have to have Black pirates? Why can't they just leave everything, and not make up these new things? Well, it's not politically correct. It's historically correct. Pirates were a major part of the activity here, and Black pirates were a major part of the groups here. They also then used the sea as an escape route. And then you had a lot of havens here, like the Dry Tortugas, which was one of the havens that they used. But this particular region is important to the Spanish for this reason. Now, once again, it was so important that one of the things they needed was to protect it. And if you were a resident of the Spanish colonies, you had to be in the militia. But again, there were never enough people in the militia. So one of the unique methods of protecting its territory from the beginning on the part of the Spanish was to use armed Black militias in the Spanish Empire, right? And you could see them here. They were part of the militia, free and enslaved. And for many of the enslaved, this was a way to earn their freedom, because any money they earned, part of it would go to their master, but part of it would be theirs. And under Spanish law, if you were baptized, you were a Christian, you were Catholic, your soul was saved, so you had the right to petition to purchase your slavery. So they would take their savings and would buy their freedom or their family. So you see them here in full Spanish uniform, and they were armed. This is going to be a big issue, because arming these free Black people is what's going to concern all of the southern states as people escape, but also as border wars occur between, for example, Georgia and Florida. Now, not only were they needed, right, they included both free and enslaved Africans, and eventually they actually create free militias of people that were pardo. Pardo would be the mulatto, and moreno would be the Black, not mixed. So not only were they part of the Spanish militia, they were actually independent militias. They had their own groups, they had their own commanders, and that commander would be also a Black, either free or an enslaved person. It wasn't necessarily a Spanish militia officer. Now, the Florida Underground is going to officially begin at this period because of something that occurs in the sense of a group of people who leave and an edict that is made. So this is going to be now the official underground, but you can see that it has had a history of people moving here and getting asylum. Now, Jane Landers, if you're interested in a book, this is an excellent book on Spanish Florida. She calls it the slave telegraph. And that's one of the questions we can address later. So keep it in mind. How did they know? How did they hear? Well, we can talk about that. But there was a slave telegraph. And once they heard what happened in Florida, this becomes sanctuary. And that's exactly what it was. It was a form of religious sanctuary. So the first group shows up in 1687, and they show up in St. Augustine. And it was 11 escaped enslaved Africans, and they were granted asylum. Why? Because they asked to be baptized. And once they asked to be baptized, now they were part of the Catholic Church, and they had a right to ask for the religious sanctuary, but they were also part of this community, because one of the conditions will be you will be baptized and you will serve in the militia. So here we have the beginnings of it. Now, the governor didn't know what to do at first. He accepted them, accepted them coming. But what he does is he asked the king, what do I do? And actually in 1693, a royal edict is officially passed. And this is what's important. As prize for having adopted the Catholic doctrine and become Catholicized, so it's linked to the religious sanctuary, set them all free. Of course, it also includes that they have to serve in the militia. But the individuals that were coming across didn't care, because this is what they wanted. They had this protection, the sanctuary, this guarantee. Now, one of the individuals that comes to this region will eventually request the establishment of his own town. And that's what we're going to look at next, Fort Mose, because this is going to play a very important role in this area. Castillo de San Marcos was the primary protection in St. Augustine, but you see the location of Fort Mose. This was the first line of defense. This was the buffer. Fort Mose is established officially in 1738. And what's significant about Fort Mose is it was a recognized free Black community, the whole community. This was the settlement in the fort. And the fort was only Black families with their commanders and the officers who had been, many of them, escaped slaves. Francisco de Menendez becomes their militia commander, and he arrives in 1724 with 9 other enslaved Africans. And they fled from the Carolina Low Country. Many of these enslaved Africans will actually come from South Carolina, from the Gullah culture area, from the Barrier Islands. And this is the route they'll take. Many of them will come down the coastline, right, following the shoreline, but some of them will come through the land. And you see, it took him, the 400 miles took him 3 years to get here. But after he arrived, he automatically becomes, right, Catholicized, accepts the Catholic religion, and he becomes a member of the militia. Within 2 years, he's the commander of the slave militia. Now, in 1738, they request officially to be all free and to have a community established, which is where Fort Mose comes in. And not only is the community established, but quickly it grows. Just within a few months, by the fall of 38, 23 Black men, women, and children arrive. So now you hear the telegraph, something's happening, this information is coming out, and they're coming down. By the end of 38, over 100 had reached the fort, right? So Fort Mose became an important settlement and the community all around it. How significant was Fort Mose? Well, in 1740, Georgia's Governor Oglethorpe attempted to take over Florida if possible, but definitely destroy the fort and capture St. Augustine. By now, the settlement of Florida has been established. Spain does not recognize it. Remember that that's considered part of La Florida. So there's this boundary dispute in which the Georgians are establishing this area. And from the beginning, Georgia was set up as a buffer zone by the British. And one of the things they wanted to do was prevent those South Carolina escaping slaves to cross into the border. So from the beginning, Georgia was actually a military fortress, if you want to think of it that way. And what he does is he comes into St. Augustine, captures and burns down Fort Mose, and everybody in the community who can flees into St. Augustine, into the San Marcos. Now, what happens is he's not able to hold on to it because the Black militia, led by Spanish militia, and the Black militia were able to take the fort using guerrilla tactics, a secret surprise attack. They actually forced the British to flee, and Oglethorpe has to leave. This was a failure for him. So what we see here is that this was an important place. This was an important situation where we put the fort because it really serves an important first line of defense for St. Augustine. Of course, they are grateful to them, and the Spanish see that the value of this militia, and this is one of the reasons why they do have so much freedom and so much acceptance and part of the community, even if they're enslaved. So we're looking at now Fort Mose as an important community, and Florida kind of holding its own until 1763. At the end of the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War in Europe, Florida was given to the British, right? Why? During that war, the British had taken Cuba, right? And the Spanish felt that Cuba was, and also I think Louisiana, the territory in Louisiana they had. And for the Spanish, Cuba was more important. Remember, that's where the fortalezas are. That's one of their areas of defense in the Caribbean. So they felt it was more important to get Florida back. So Cuba back. So they give Florida to the British. For this, of course, it was a terrible blow for the community because the Spanish will leave. And of course, the members of the community and the militia who were Black and in Fort Mose, they will have to also leave, because now the British are coming in and the British practiced slavery. And some of these individuals that are living in Florida were actually either themselves had been enslaved in the British territory or are the descendants of these individuals. So you have this massive migration out of Florida into Cuba. About 3,000 plus of the residents, right? And they were very mixed community. They go to Cuba. And fearing enslavement, Menendez and the militia, not all of them, but most of them decide that they will go with the Spanish to Cuba. Now, this is remember I mentioned Cuba as one of the parts of the railroad? This is that leg of the railroad. They will get sanctuary in Cuba. They will establish a community they call Nueva Florida, near Matanzas province. And this particular community will basically stay there. They eventually, I think Menendez leaves there and goes to Havana. They will come back to Florida, some of them. I don't know what happened to this community. I've been trying to do some research, but this is a community that was created. So it was also a Maroon community and one of the legs of the railroad. We're going to look at another group now in particular. We're going to look at what we call the Black Seminoles. They were Maroons also, and what becomes a different situation here is this joining of an alliance, making an alliance with the Seminoles of Florida, who themselves actually were many tribes who had fled the North also because they were losing their lands, because in some cases they were being enslaved by other groups, in particular other Native American tribes. So we have now the next group in the community that we're going to examine are the Maroons. Now let's look over here. You can see here Fort Mose, but what I wanted to emphasize was that Fort Mose is not the only settlement. You see all of these? These were known settlements within Florida, right? Here, this, by the way, is, we're going to see it later, but this is the Pensacola Negro Fort. But they existed within this area. These were settlements of Black and Seminole groups within Florida, and these are the ones that were documented. They actually had names that were linked to the community, and you can almost tell which was a Seminole settlement and which was a Black Seminole or enslaved African or Maroon settlement. Now, when we look at this settlement, why do we have these areas? Not all of the Maroons really wanted to stay in St. Augustine and serve in the militia. They didn't want that commitment. They didn't want that control. So what they did was they fled into these areas of the wilderness and just set up their own settlements. And these were important to them because, as you can see, they were independent settlements, all right? And this is what they wanted. They wanted not only to be able to have their freedom, but to establish communities where they would live in freedom. Now, one of the things that occurs in this area is the establishment or creation of alliances, allies. They become allies of the Seminoles. And this is going to be very important during the Seminole Wars. So basically, facing a common enemy now, the Maroons and the Seminoles formed a military alliance. They will be called by different names. In particular, they'll be called Black Seminoles. They'll be called Black Indians. Now, they're not all Black Indians. Some of them did marry into the Native American tribes, especially the men, because their children would be free. The Native Americans were not enslaved. They were not sold into slavery the same way that the Black population was. So they would marry into these tribes because they were matrilineal, and marrying into the women's line, their children would be free. So you have them joining forces with them, sometimes intermarrying, sometimes just living next to them. And you can see that their towns were very distinct. Here we have Powellstown. So this was definitely a Black community or Black settlement next to the Seminoles. Mulatto's Girl Town, all right, another one. Now there's a question here whether they were all free or not. It is documented that many of them were considered slaves of the Seminoles. However, they were not necessarily chattel slavery. The Seminoles did not sell them. They were more like the serf system. They basically allied with them. They supported them. They shared their land. They shared their food. And this became a way for them to coexist, but also depend on each other. So some of them were considered the slaves of the Seminoles, but not under the traditional chattel system of enslavement that we have in the North, the buying and selling of slaves. So let's look at the Negro Fort. The Negro Fort is a new settlement that is established, and it's another area that's part of the Underground Railroad. Specifically, Negro Fort is going to be right on that boundary at that point of what would be Florida along the Apalachicola River and Georgia, I believe, and maybe the Mississippi Territory, which will be Alabama. This area today is a historic site. It's located in Franklin County. And as this particular site was actually discovered, I believe, after the Hurricane Michael, because it blew through that area and the whole region was kind of deforested, and you could see what the fort remains were. Now, this fort was a challenge, all right, because it's right across the border, right across the boundary. And as long as it existed, the plantation society, the slave society in the North did not want it to be there. it became part of their efforts to take the territory, but also destroy these communities. So where specifically was the Negro fort? It's over here, all right? The fort, the area of Pensacola, and you see the boundary here. Now, this particular fort was actually established by the British during the War of 1812. And what happened is that they started building a fort, started arming the native population, and started bringing, encouraging enslaved Africans to flee across the border. And when they did, they armed them, but also made them part of their colonial Marines. You can see who these guys are. But this particular area then is an armed area, and it's part of the strategy that the British had to reclaim during the War of 1812, to reclaim their territory. Of course, the events in Europe, especially the Napoleonic Wars, forced the British to kind of, end the War of 1812 and focus their attention in Europe and dealing with Napoleon. But when they leave the fort. And this fort was fully armed, and it included members of the colonial, I don't know what the sign is, members of the colonial Marines. Now, who were the colonial Marines? During the American Revolution, especially in the South, one of the strategies used by the British was to offer freedom to any of the slaves in the South and the North who joined the British fighting the Americans. And they incorporated them into this group called the Colonial Marines. They were like their Black fighting force. And as you can see, they wore uniforms. This was their non-service uniform. This was their fighting uniform. So you could tell that they were part of the British military. And they were part of the Marines. They had rank. They had a commission. They got paid. And when they're disbanded, when the British leave, they will get paid off. And many of them will leave with the British, basically for Bermuda. However, not all of them decided to leave. Some of them decide to stay at the fort and work with the enslaved Africans that had been coming into the fort, also in an attempt to stop to support the Indians and support the British, and to stop the encroachment of the Americans to this territory. So what we have in 1815 is the evacuation of about 400 of them and their allies. They're disbanded, but not all of them. The ones that stay are actually joined by about 800 Black fugitives who are coming from the surrounding area. So you can see that this was a very important area for them, the fort, because it's fortified, but also a big threat to the border and a big threat to the planters in the South. Unfortunately, the fort doesn't last too long, and basically in one battle, it is destroyed. What happened was a hot shot, all right? The basic attempt to keep this area was part of the problem was that they really were not probably well trained, but they did have a fully fortified and equipped fort. And because of this, in particular, the military led by Andrew Jackson, he was very determined, decided that they needed to do away with this fort. They had to get rid of this area. They had to defeat them. But this is Spanish territory. So basically, right across the boundary, this is the river, this is the boundary. What he did was he brought in boats, he brought in military, he brought in part of the Navy, and kind of waited. He kind of waited for an opportunity because he wasn't supposed to be here. But as long as he was on the other side, everything was fine. But basically what he does is he looks for an opportunity to provoke a fight. And it happens when one particular day, one of their ships gets too close and the fort fires on them, all right? Now it's open war because they've been attacked. So they start opening fire. Basically, like 9 or 10 cannonballs is all that they are able to shoot. But what happens? One of them enters the fort's magazine. And the explosion was horrendous. They, as you can see, they were supposedly heard in Pensacola. More than 200 of the escaped slaves and natives died instantly in the blast. The documents written by the Americans who were here, they basically said that it was horrible, that the wounds, the conditions under which they found them, what they had to do to get them out, it was very, very sad and very final, that there was no way that they could survive. Even the few that survived and they were able to take out didn't make it. Of course, those that did survive were taken by the Americans and sold into slavery, because this was one of the other goals. Remember, to destroy this fort. So what we have now is them taking whoever survived into slavery, but then you have a whole number of the escaped slaves and the Seminoles and the Indians and these Marines who flee further south, because we're going to continue now these engagements where they're continuing to move further south. And this is where the alliance with the Seminoles becomes stronger. We're entering the period of the Seminole Wars. This is considered the largest slave rebellion. And what happens is that the military, especially General Jessup, he says it clearly, that they call it an Indian war, but this is a Negro war, because the Seminoles who were fought with the Seminoles, the Black Seminoles who fought with the Seminoles, they were determined that they were not going to be taken back into slavery. And, they had a lot to lose. So you're going to see them joining with them and fighting with them and dying with them under different circumstances. What were the causes of the three wars? We're only going to look at the first two. Basically, it's land and the threat of slavery. Land, because the U.S. wanted to protect its border. Remember that border between the United States and Florida. It's very important not to have any foreign power there. And they always feared that if it wasn't the Spanish, it might be the British, because they had already come in the War of 1812. The encroachment into Seminole lands by American settlers. At this point, you have this interest in expanding into the territory, what was considered free land. And the Seminole lands were farmlands. They had settlements, but they wanted this land and they encroach into them. The expansion of the plantation system. The United States has now basically divided between a free North and a slave South. And politically, it was very important for them to have as many slave states in the system as they were to have free states, because this is going to be important in the balance of power in the Congress, in particular in the Senate. Remember, you had equal representation. So it was very important to have at least 50-50, that you had the same amount of North versus Southern states, so that you could have control of the Senate, but also have control in the House. So the expansion of slavery into this territory is important, because Florida will be a new slave state. Another importance is the freedom that this area posed for escaped slaves. They did not want that. They needed to stop this. They needed to end the sanctuary. And of course, the alarm they had of these free armed Black people directly across from Slave South. Why? Because this was a refuge, and they knew that every person who fled from their plantation, every escaped slave from their plantation, was going to join these free armed Black people who were going to, in the end, fight against them. And finally, the Seminole Wars were about removing all of the natives of Florida. This was a goal from the beginning. In the first Seminole War, right, 1817 to 1818, this territory was not even part of the United States yet, right? This is going to actually be the reason why Florida decides to sell the state. And the battles were fierce. The pushback on the part of the Seminoles and the enslaved Africans, the Black Seminoles, was also fierce. But it becomes difficult when you're facing an army that is basically well equipped. So what we have here is the end of the first Seminole War, ending with the Seminoles losing their land and being forced into one of the first reservations, all right? By the end of the Seminole War and the Treaty of Moultrie Creek, they're basically isolated to this region. Now, this is an area in which the Seminoles and their native, their Black Seminole allies go. Not all of them. Some of them flee further south here. Now, this reservation was supposed to be theirs. They were supposed to be protected. Conditions were terrible. They don't get the supplies that they were promised. Many of them are actually starving. So they start looking for food. They start going out of the reservation. And once they go out of the reservation, they're coming in contact with these new settlers. And from the beginning, the idea was, you got to move them out. You got to move them out. They pose a danger. They're a threat. So what we have then, even though there was a treaty that protected them, this treaty being violated by both sides. So what we have is then a movement further south into the area. And the next area we're looking at, which was a Maroon community, was Angola, Florida. Angola, Florida, as you can see, is the Manatee River right here in the Mineral Springs. This community was interesting and very different because it was one of the largest groups of largest enslaved settlement that they had the largest settlement of enslaved Africans who had fled and organized themselves here. This community had between like 600 and 700 escaped slaves. This was not common because it was safer to be in smaller groups and to be into these large areas. But this particular settlement was believed to be further enough south. This was a reproduction of it because Angola settlement has been excavated, and there is now a historic site now. There's also excavation still going on, but it was a community. It was a community of permanent settlements. So what we're looking at here was a community that was definitely on the list of those that had to be destroyed. And this was one community that Andrew Jackson was determined to find and destroy. And this is exactly what he does. He basically attacks and burns down the settlement. They capture about 250 or 300, which they into slavery, but many of them flee. And how do they flee? They choose to go to the Bahamas. This is going to be the beginning of what's called the Saltwater Underground Railroad. This is another destination. The destination is called Andros Island. It exists still today. So when we go into this particular group of Angola, the community was destroyed, but they still found a way to escape and get refuge. Now, where they escaped from was specifically from the area of Cape Florida. You recognize the lighthouse here. This is part of the Freedom Trail or the historical trail. It's recognized as part of the Underground Railroad because they would come here and from here find a way to reach the Bahamas, very often helped by the Bahamians, by the Native Americans. If something could float, they would take it to the Bahamas. One of the reasons why this particular building, the lighthouse was built, was to stop this. So it was, even though it was also to help sailors, it was to end this area being a point where they could leave because the lighthouse would now brighten this region. So it was very difficult to at night escape. Now, how many escaped? Evidently, this region became a route for them until 1861. But just between 1821, when the territory, Florida becomes a territory, and in 1837, you had constantly the area being used by runaway slaves. Now, by the 1830s, about 6,000 free and enslaved Black people escaped because even the free people recognized they were not going to have their freedom recognized under the slave system. Basically, the attitude was, you may be free, but there's no proof, but also you are the descendant of an escaped slave. So they would not recognize or acknowledge their freedom. So the Saltwater Underground Railroad was this beacon in this area, this part of this arm, which really existed until pretty much 1861, about, I think. Now, as you can see, 6,000, all right, that they calculated just by the 1830s. Today, Angola has been excavated. They're still doing some work there. It is a refuge of peace. It's one of those areas that have a marker in Florida. In 2018, right after this area here, this cultural center was set up, they actually brought inhabitants from Andros Island, the Bahamas, to the community to celebrate a festival. And the people of Andros Islands know the history. They know who their descendants, who they're descendants of, and they know that they are what they call the Black Indians. So this was kind of a meeting again with individuals in Florida, because there are also Black Seminoles in Florida, but this return for this community to the Angola settlement. Of course, the Indian Removal Act is going to be what's going to cause a major issue for the Florida Indians, Seminoles, as well as the Black Seminoles, because it's going to require that all of the Native Americans that are in the territory west of the Mississippi be moved out, right? They have to give up their ancestral lands and be moved out to the Indian territories, basically Oklahoma and I believe Arkansas. So for the Native Americans, Seminoles, and for the enslaved Africans, this is a problem because they are the target of this movement. They're going to be the ones that are going to be forced to leave. And the Second Seminole War was basically about that. It was about forcing them to leave and the native population resisting with their armed allies. What eventually happens is that they leave. They are not able to win the war. They could not again follow, the tactics. They basically used guerrilla tactics. The military started to burn their settlements, capture their families, to force the men to give up, to submit to the removal. And about 3,000 Seminoles were finally removed, and about 500 of the Black Seminoles traveled with them. So there was a relationship here. Probably these were Black Seminoles who were related to the tribe, who had children, who had married into them, and probably were Black Indians, mixed Indian and enslaved African. Of course, as many others died on the Trail of Tears, many of them also died on the Trail of Tears. This particular war, the second one was probably the longest and the costliest of the Indian wars. During the period, 40,000 military personnel fought, only 4,800 Seminoles approximately, and 800 allies. So this can tell you the determination and to some degree how successful they were. But again, after 10 years of fighting and not having any resources to replenish their fighting, they ended up giving up. But look at the cost in that time frame, $40 million just to fight the Seminoles and force them to leave this territory for the Indian Territory. Now, we're going to look at the last leg of the Florida Underground Railroad, freedom on the border. Well, what border? Because now we know the northern border is gone. Well, it's going to be a new southern border. To the Maroons, it was this border that prevented enslavement until 1865. Among the Black Seminoles that fought, the native population, one of their major leaders was this young man. He was called John Horse, and they did, one of the individuals that fought with them during the war. So during the Second Seminole War, by 1838, he realizes that they're just not going to be able to continue this fight. He was an interpreter. He worked with both the Native Americans and with the Americans, because he spoke English and he spoke the native tribes. Language. So he was able to finally convince them that we will leave. So he negotiates. He negotiates with the military, with Jessup. He negotiates that they will leave, but under a particular condition, that their freedom will be recognized. At that point, that's the agreement. And in 1838, they promise that they will stop fighting. They do a ceasefire and they accept the resettlement. And Jessup recognizes their freedom. So this is actually an official emancipation for the Black Seminoles, the first time that this kind of emancipation occurs. The Northerners were very upset, especially the slave owners in the South and any of the Southern states, and they felt that the military did not have a right to do this. So you already see what's going to happen. They're not going to be acknowledging or recognizing this freedom. And of course, even though they had been freed, they're concerned that despite this free status, that they're not going to be able to stay free. They do go to the territory, all right, but fearing enslavement and recognizing that it's already happening because the Southerners, slave catchers, are going into the territory and capturing them. The Cree Indians that were there and some other tribes were capturing them too because they practiced chattel slavery. They didn't like the idea of the Seminoles having these Black Seminoles who were basically free in their community. So what they decide to do is they will leave. So 180 of the Black Seminoles in 1849 leave for northern Mexico. Why northern Mexico? Slavery had been abolished in Mexico. The Mexican government welcomes them. They get asylum. They actually give them a settlement in Nacimiento. Why? What is the deal? You will be free, but we need a border patrol. We need someone that is going to protect us from the native population of the Plains Indians that were crossing the border, but also the Texans that were crossing the border. So for the next 20 years, they become the border patrol between Texas and Mexico, keeping the Texans out of Mexico. These particular Black Seminoles are still called, they're Mascogos in Mexico. This is their route. See, they go by sea, then they trekked up by land to the territory, and then they flee. right into Mexico. And this is the border that they basically protect. And they protected until 1865, until the end of slavery, the Civil War, and the abolition of slavery. The final Maroon settlement then in this region will be El Nacimiento in Mexico. This is the last route of the Underground Railroad, all right? Today, both Red Bay's Andros and Andros Island and in Bahamas and this Mexican settlement are part of the Network Freedom Trail. Now, what happened to these individuals? Well, they stayed there until 1865 later. And then once slavery is ended in the United States and the United States starts to engage in war with the Plains Indians, they get recruited and they become the Black Seminole Indian Scouts. They actually were part of the Buffalo Soldiers. They were their scouts, and they participated in the Indian wars in the Plains area during this period. So this group of individuals eventually ended up moving and living in Brackettville, Texas. So this is actually, I consider Brackettville the last Maroon settlement, because once they crossed the border from Mexico, then this is the last place where these Maroons and their descendants settle. Today, their descendants still live in Oklahoma, Texas, the Bahamas, and northern Mexico. Who are they? In the 19th century, they were called Seminole Negroes by the white enemies because they belonged to the Seminoles, and Black people by the Indians. They didn't necessarily call them Seminoles. They might call them Black Seminoles, but not really. Now, the ones that ended up in Oklahoma will get their freedom once slavery is abolished in the United States. So they're known as the Seminole freedmen. That's what they still are. They're a band of the tribe up in Oklahoma. Now, the Black Indians is their official name in Andros Island. They still call them Black Indians. The Bahamians call them that. Of course, we all know that they're called Mascaros in Mexico. And in Texas now, their population and the group that's there, they're called the descendants of the Seminole Scouts. Okay, today's presentation is a story about a people who had this desire for freedom and never stopped trying to get it. And were successful when we see the history of how they fought and established settlements throughout Florida and other parts in their Florida Underground Railroad sites. Thank you very much. And I guess we have questions. This is the perfect time for any questions or any information or any comments. I would appreciate them.
We had one question in the chat. Someone asked about let's see, what a horse, but you talked about him, John Horse.
John Horse. Yes. He was yeah. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Danny, did she answer your question?
I don't know what her question was. John Horse was actually a Black Seminole. He was a Black Indian, that, in the sense that his mother was Native American and his father was a slave. So he's an example of that mixture, a true mixture between the tribes. He wasn't a Black Seminole in the sense that he was just, his family were allies. He's very interesting, and I'm going to add something more to him for a second here. The fact that he was able to get that emancipation, that they were able to recognize their freedom, it actually became the basis later for the Proclamation of Emancipation, because what they did in, the basis of the proclamation was basically for the slave states, because those are the only groups that were given freedom during the Civil War. They were given freedom if they joined the Union in fighting. So this was a source of emancipation, but also if they left the Confederacy, if they didn't support the Confederacy. And in the end, the Confederacy started offering the enslaved Africans freedom also to fight, which I don't think any of them took them up on. I don't see why at that point, right? But the John Horse is an example of that group that was an ally, that was part of the community, that was a leader, and that really found, more than one way to get freedom for his people. And in the end, he basically found the final refuge, because that was the last leg of the Underground Railroad.
Excellent.
Anybody have any other questions?
Is any of this taught in Florida high school classes?
I don't know. because I don't teach in Florida high schools. I would hope that it is. Definitely Fort Mose, I'm sure is. I don't know about the other areas. When I was at the college, I did programs. I always believed, and I'm retired now, but I always believed that education had to occur outside of the classroom sometimes. And definitely for programs like for Black History Month, I would do programs. That's when I first did this program, 2000 something at Miami-Dade College, because there was no Florida history class. There wasn't enough enrollment in Miami-Dade College. There was no interest in it. So any subject or any class that I couldn't teach in the classroom, then I would make sure that I would do it by doing presentations. In the sense of my American history classes, when I covered that period of the war, I would cover some of this information, but the focus was basically American history, and the period. This particular period was focusing on the acquisition, the annexation of Florida, and we covered things like the Trail of Tears. But even myself, when I studied my degree, I didn't know this. I never encountered any of this in one book that I researched until I did my master's, because then I started looking at the archives and books that are produced by the Spanish authorities, because my master's was on history of the Caribbean and Latin America. And one of the things that I ended up doing was reading the Spanish archives. And that's where I learned a lot of this information, which surprised me, because again, my undergrad major was American history. And in all of my education, up until I graduated from my bachelor's in the 1970s, I never once in any American history class learned about any of this myself. So it's this information that has been missing from books, yes. Hopefully it's not. Is there anybody here who's in a high school class or knows? Maybe they could answer, because again, I don't teach in the high schools. I haven't taught in the high schools in Florida.
You can go ahead and unmute yourself if you'd like, if you've got an answer for Magdalena. Magdalena, thank you very much for tonight's presentation. Excellent.
I tried, and I think I rushed a little bit. My husband was telling me to slow down, but I wanted to get to the end. Oh, I did want to make a comment. Nobody asked, how did they hear the Underground Railroad? What was the telegraph? Did anybody know what the telegraph wants to know what you think it is? Because how did they hear about Fort Mose, and how did they hear about St. Augustine? How did they know that this was a place to go? Because running away and just running away is one thing, but they actually knew. They knew to go to St. Augustine and ask for asylum. Okay. The idea is that two things: the pirates, and they're going up and down the coast and making communication. This was one source of information of where you could go if you wanted. You didn't want to be a pirate, then you go to St. Augustine. But also remember, this is a boundary between Florida and the United States, and there was trade. And they believed that what was happening was that some of the Spaniards would come with their slaves, because I do want to say something about St. Augustine in particular. They may have offered asylum, but they didn't really free their own slaves. This wasn't altruism. This wasn't because they really wanted or supported, the end of slavery. They had their own slaves. They may have been treated a little differently. There was opportunity for freedom, right? But they had their own slaves. When they offered this asylum, there was a condition. You had to come from either a British, a Portuguese, a French, I'm trying to think, the Dutch. If you fled from one of the enemies of Spain, then you would be granted the asylum. It was not given to the Spanish enslaved Africans. Now, one of the things that you could do is you could, again, if you served as a conquistador or you served in the militia, you could gain your freedom eventually, just by service too. That was one of the differences. But very often the Spanish traders, the merchants, the ships would go up and they would trade along the coast. And sometimes the slaves would come with the merchants from the north, Georgia and South Carolina. And the information probably moved that way. That's one of the sources basically mentioned, that there was information that was given, because otherwise, why take this risk? Because you're talking about being chased by the slave catchers and the danger. If they came down the coast, you know what it's like coming. They didn't have the supplies. They didn't have a good boat. So the telegraph has always been an interesting thing that has fascinated me. One of the best books, this is a good one if you're interested, on the Black Society in Spanish Florida. Excellent book. And if anybody wants a reading list, just email me, okay? And thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you, Magdalena. Everyone, thank you for joining us tonight. This will be recorded and available on our YouTube site shortly. Have a great night, everyone.
This was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Welcome.